An out-of-control HOA president tried to bully me with thousands of dollars in fines on the property I had just inherited. She threatened me, harassed me, and tried to turn an entire community against me by manufacturing lies and wielding rules that didn't apply. She saw me as an easy target, a city slicker who wouldn't fight back. What she didn't know was that her precious little kingdom had absolutely no power over me. She had no idea that my entire professional life was dedicated to dismantling the very kind of baseless legal threats she was building her throne upon. She had no idea I was a real estate lawyer and that I was about to walk into her annual HOA meeting with the one thing that would destroy her reign of terror forever, the proof. This isn't just a revenge story. It's the story of how I unraveled a petty tyrant's abuse of power and fired the Karen president who built her throne on a foundation of lies. It all started the way these stories often do, with a loss. My grandfather, a man who cherished solitude more than company, passed away. We weren't incredibly close. He was a man of the land, content with his sprawling property and the quiet hum of nature. At the same time, I had built my life in the city, navigating concrete canyons and the complex world of real estate law. He was a figure of quiet principle, a man who believed in clear boundaries and living right. I remembered him once telling me, "A man's word is his bond, but his signature on a plat map is forever." At the time, I thought it was just one of his folksy sayings. I had no idea how prophetic it would be. When his lawyer called, I was expecting a few dusty photo albums and maybe an old pocket watch. My life was a whirlwind of billable hours, contentious depositions, and the endless grinding pressure of a downtown law firm. The last thing on my mind was a trip to the mountains. "Your grandfather left his entire estate to you," the lawyer said, his voice grave but clear. I was picturing a modest savings account and a well-used pickup truck. The cabin, the tools, and the land. There was a pause. All 847 acres of it. I nearly dropped the phone. I knew he had land, but the scale of it was unfathomable. It was an inheritance of pristine wilderness. The property was breathtaking, a world away from the smog and noise of my city life. A massive tract of land with dense, ancient forests, open meadows bursting with wildflowers, and a crystal-clear stream cutting through the valley. The air itself felt different, clean and sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. My grandfather's old log cabin, which he had built with his own hands decades ago, sat on a bluff overlooking it all. It was sturdy and honest, crafted from the land on which it stood. Inside, it smelled of cedar and wood smoke. It felt like my own private national park. My plan was simple: honor his legacy by preserving the land. Use the cabin as a weekend getaway from the legal battles and boardroom brawls, and find some of the peace that he had valued so much. I spent the first few weeks just exploring, immersing myself in the quiet solitude. I'd hike for miles with a compass and his old hand-drawn maps, marveling at the sheer scale of it all. I was rediscovering a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. But on the far eastern edge of the property, nestled in a valley that looked like it had been carved out with a gentle hand, I found something that wasn't on any of his maps: a community. It was a development of approximately 120 houses, a stark contrast to the surrounding untamed wilderness. All the homes had perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a big welcoming sign that read, "Welcome to Whispering Pines, a premier HOA community. I was Cobit, maybe it has even concluded." I pulled out the professional survey maps that came with the inheritance documents. Sure enough, the Whispering Pines development was adjacent to my land, but the legal boundaries were crystal clear. My grandfather had sold off that specific 50-acre parcel for the development decades ago, while carefully retaining his cabin and the surrounding 800-plus acres for himself. He had drawn his line in the sand, both figuratively and literally. I made a mental note to be a good neighbor. I had no interest in their rules or their community, but I respected their right to exist. We could coexist peacefully, two separate worlds sharing a valley. I was, as it turned out, catastrophically wrong. My first encounter with the Queen of Whispering Pines was about to set the stage for a war I never wanted to fight, but one I was uniquely qualified to win. My first official notice from the Whispering Pines HOA arrived a week after I'd put a fresh coat of paint on my grandfather's mailbox. It wasn't the standard, soul-crushingly bland black that apparently graced the rest of the community. I had found a half-used can of paint in the old shed, a deep forest green, the same color he'd used on the cabin's trim. It felt like a small act of remembrance, a way to breathe a little life back into the place. The letter that arrived was anything but friendly. It was printed on thick, expensive-feeling cardstock, and the language was aggressive and accusatory. It was a formal citation. "The property at Warren Old Valley Road," it began, its tone oozing with bureaucratic menace, "violates Whispering Pines covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Article 4, Section B, Uniformity of Mail Receptacles. The approved color for all mail receptacles is black satin, SW 6990. The unapproved color forest green must be rectified within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $500, followed by a $50 per day penalty until the violation is cured." I actually laughed it off at first, shaking my head at the absurdity. My cabin wasn't even in their development. It was a mile up a private gravel road, completely isolated. They had no jurisdiction over me. As a lawyer, my mind immediately classified it as a frivolous claim, an amateurish overreach. I decided to handle it with simple, undeniable facts. I wrote a polite, simple letter back, explaining that my property was not part of the Whispering Pines HOA, and therefore their rules and CC&Rs didn't apply to me. For good measure, I included a high-quality copy of the official county plat map, with my property clearly delineated, and thought that would be the end of it. That letter was the equivalent of poking a hornet's nest with a giant stick. 2 days later, I heard the high-pitched whine of an electric motor. A golf cart came roaring up my gravel driveway, kicking up stones. At the wheel was a woman who practically vibrated with self-importance. She had the stereotypical haircut that prompted her to ask to speak to the manager, expensive Oakley sunglasses perched on her head, and a clipboard clutched in her hand like a scepter. This, I would soon learn, was Carol, the HOA president. "I am Carol," she announced, stepping out of the cart without so much as a hello. Her voice was sharp, used to immediate obedience. "I received your little note. You seem to be under some misapprehension. This entire valley is Whispering Pines. That sign at the entrance isn't just for decoration." I tried to be reasonable, to de-escalate. "Hi, Carol, I'm the new owner. It's a pleasure to meet you. As I explained in my letter, the official county records and the filed plat map clearly show that my land is separate from your development. Your HOA's jurisdiction ends down at the creek." I pointed in the direction of the boundary line. She scoffed, a little puff of air that was pure condescension. "Honey, I've been president of this HOA for 10 years. I know what land we control. The developer established our community boundaries when this place was founded, and your little cabin falls right within them. Now, about the mailbox. You have 5 days to paint it black." She turned to leave, dismissing me as if I were a misbehaving child. But then her eyes narrowed, scanning my grandfather's cabin. It was rustic, built of logs from the land itself, and perfectly suited to its environment. To Carol, it was an eyesore that offended her sense of aesthetics. "And another thing," she said, her voice dripping with disdain as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger. "That structure, the color of the wood stain is not on the approved palette. It's far too dark, and you have unapproved vegetation near the foundation." She was pointing at a patch of black-eyed Susans and wild ferns my grandfather had cultivated. "I'm going to have to write you up for that as well. We have standards here. We like to keep our community looking pristine." Before I could even process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her trespassing on my land to critique my grandfather's home, she was back in her golf cart, leaving a cloud of dust and indignation behind. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. Over the next month, my peaceful retreat became a living nightmare. Carol was relentless, a one-woman siege engine of petty tyranny. The official notices started piling up, each one more unhinged than the last. The fine for the green mailbox had been left unpaid, so it had ballooned to over $2,000 with daily penalties. Then came the new violations, each one a work of malicious fiction. My unapproved vegetation, the patch of native wildflowers my grandfather had spent years cultivating, earned me a fine of $500. A letter claimed it was a noxious weed colony that threatened the aesthetic integrity of the community. The unapproved wood stain on my log cabin, a cabin 50 years older. Then her entire community was hit with a staggering $5,000 fine for failure to conform to the approved color palette. She cited me for the gravel on my driveway, unapproved road surface material, for having a small, neatly arranged stack of firewood visible from the road, unsecured debris, and even for the type of curtains in my windows, which she could have only seen with binoculars, non-conforming window treatments. The total in bogus fines shot past $10,000 in less than 30 days. Each letter was more threatening than the last, mentioning legal action, liens on my property, and even foreclosure. It was absurd. It was textbook harassment, but the sheer volume of official-looking mail was starting to feel very real. Then the psychological warfare began. I'd see Carol's golf cart parked at the end of my long driveway just watching my house. Sometimes she'd bring other board members, pointing and taking pictures like tourists on a safari of suburban decay. They were trying to intimidate me, to create a sense of constant surveillance. One afternoon, I came home to find a contractor's truck parked on my property. A man was standing there with a paint sprayer, hooking up a hose, getting ready to paint my mailbox black. I saw red. "What do you think you're doing?" I yelled, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. The man, a local painter just trying to make a living, looked startled. "Whoa, take it easy, man." The HOA president, Carol, hired me. Said this mailbox was a violation and to paint it, then send her the bill. Said the homeowner was difficult. "This is private property," I said, my voice low and firm as I stood directly between him and the mailbox. "You are trespassing. Suppose you so much as touch my property with that sprayer. In that case, I will call the sheriff and have you charged with criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. You can explain to the judge why you thought it was okay to deface private property without the owner's consent." His eyes widened as he realized the legal jeopardy he was in. He packed up his gear in record time and left, peeling out of my driveway. But the incident shook me to my core. This wasn't just about letters anymore. Carol felt so entitled and untouchable that she believed she could send people onto my land to modify my property against my will. I called the sheriff's department. The deputy who came out was sympathetic, a weary-looking man who had seen his share of neighborly disputes. "Sir, I understand your frustration, I really do," he said, looking at the stack of violation notices on my kitchen table. "But this is an HOA dispute. It's a civil matter. Our hands are tied unless they actually damage your property or physically refuse to leave when you tell them to. You'll have to take it up with them in court." Carol saw the sheriff's visit not as a warning, but as a victory. She now believed the law was on her side. The next day, a new notice was taped aggressively to my front door. It was a final demand for $15,150 in fines, plus a new, vindictive $2,500 fine for interfering with an HOA-sanctioned vendor. The letter stated, in bold, underlined text, that if the full amount weren't paid within 48 hours, the HOA would place a lien on my property and initiate foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure on my 847 acres for a green mailbox. The sheer gall of it was breathtaking. It was a declaration of total war. I had tried to be polite. I had tried to be reasonable. I had presented clear legal evidence. She had responded with escalation, intimidation, and now the ultimate threat. She had pushed me too far. She didn't know who she was dealing with. She saw me as some city boy who inherited a shack. She had no idea my entire career was built on dismantling fraudulent arguments exactly like hers. The time for being nice was over. It was time to go to work. That night, fueled by black coffee and a righteous indignation that burned hotter than any furnace, I turned my grandfather's dusty study upside down. The room was a time capsule, filled with books on forestry, botany, and engineering. I was looking for the entire history of this land. As a real estate lawyer, I know that property history is a story, a narrative told through deeds, surveys, and declarations. You have to read all the words to understand the plot. Buried in an old metal filing cabinet tucked away under decades of neatly filed tax receipts and tractor maintenance logs, I found it. It was a thick, leather-bound folder, the kind used for essential documents, labeled property in my grandfather's sharp, decisive handwriting. Inside was a treasure trove of deeds, surveys, and county correspondence going back to when he first bought the land. And then, at the very back, I found a separate, thinner file that changed everything. It was labeled Land Sale, Pristine Valley Homes. My heart started hammering. Pristine Valley Homes was the original developer of Whispering Pines. Inside was the original, fully executed contract from the late 1980s between my grandfather and the developer. It detailed the sale of a specific 50-acre parcel on the eastern edge of his land. But stapled to the back, an integral part of the official filing, was the key. It was the official survey map from the sale, the very one filed with the county recorder's office to make the transfer legal. On the map, the 50 acres for what would become Whispering Pines were outlined in red ink. My grandfather's remaining 800-plus acres, including the bluff with his cabin, were outlined in blue. In his unmistakable handwriting, my grandfather had written a note in the margin next to the blue section, a note that was initialed by both him and the developer's representative. To be permanently and irrevocably excluded from the Pristine Valley Homes development, its covenants, its conditions, its restrictions, and its subsequent Homeowners Association in perpetuity. My blood ran cold with adrenaline. This wasn't just a note scribbled in the margins. This was a legally binding part of the recorded land transfer. This was the smoking gun. It was a declaration of independence for his property, signed, sealed, and delivered before the first foundation of Whispering Pines was ever poured. Carol's entire claim, her entire reign of terror, was based on a complete and utter lie. She was either deliberately ignoring the legal boundaries of her own HOA in a shocking display of malicious overreach, or she had never bothered to look at the real foundational documents, relying instead on some vague marketing map from a sales brochure. She wasn't just an overzealous president. She was acting completely outside her legal authority, perpetrating a fraud. Every fine she had levied, every threat she had made, was illegitimate. Every ounce of stress she had caused was based on a fantasy of power. Carol wasn't the power-tripping president of my community. She was the power-tripping president of a neighboring community, harassing a private landowner over whom she had absolutely no jurisdiction. I felt a cold, clear sense of purpose wash over me. The focused calm of a lawyer with an airtight case replaced the anger. I spent the next 2 weeks coordinating with my law firm back in the city. We retrieved the official, certified records from the county archives, confirming that our copy of the plat map and the attached addendum were the ones on file. We had everything. The evidence was ironclad, unimpeachable, and utterly irrefutable. The annual Whispering Pines HOA meeting was just 3 days away. The agenda, which Carol had proudly posted online, listed a public vote to authorize the HOA's legal counsel to begin foreclosure proceedings on my property. She was planning to use the meeting for my public execution. She had no idea I was about to dismantle her entire world. The community clubhouse was packed, stuffy with the scent of stale coffee and nervous energy. It seemed every resident of Whispering Pines was there, drawn by the advertised drama. Carol had clearly framed the main event as a spectacle, the foreclosure vote against the defiant, rule-breaking owner of the shack on the hill. I saw people whispering and pointing as I walked in, dressed not in hiking clothes but in a tailored suit, and took a seat in the back. I was carrying a heavy leather briefcase that felt as if it were filled with lead. Carol was at a podium at the front of the room, basking in the attention. This was her coronation, and I was to be the sacrificial lamb. She started the meeting with tedious procedural matters. Still, her eyes kept flicking back to me, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Finally, she arrived at the main event. "And now," she announced, her voice booming with theatrical importance, We move to Agenda Item 7B, action regarding the property at 1 Old Valley Road. As many of you are aware, the owner of this property has consistently shown a flagrant disregard for our community standards. This disregard threatens our property values and the very fabric of our neighborhood. She launched into a 15-minute tirade, a masterclass in propaganda. She listed every fabricated violation, painting me as a hostile, arrogant outsider who thought he was above the rules that held their perfect community together. She spoke of the decrepit mailbox, the overgrown weeds, and the unacceptable state of my cabin. This man believes he is above us, she declared, her voice rising with manufactured outrage. He has arrogantly refused to pay his fines, which now total over $20,000. If we let one person flout our rules, we open the door to chaos. We must send a message that the rules of Whispering Pines are not optional. She pointed a dramatic, trembling finger directly at me. Therefore, I call for a vote to authorize our legal counsel to proceed with foreclosure on the property at 1 Old Valley Road. A wave of tense murmurs went through the crowd. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting her declaration settle in the air. Then I stood up. "Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear, projecting easily to the back of the room. "Before you call that vote, there's a rather significant point of order you've overlooked." Carol's eyes narrowed into slits of pure fury. "You are out of order. You are not a member of this association! Sit down!" "I don't think so," I said, walking slowly and deliberately to the front of the room, my hard-soled shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. The room fell silent. You see, to foreclose on a property, an HOA must first have a legal jurisdictional claim over it. And that, Madam President, is where your entire premise, your entire campaign of harassment, completely falls apart. I placed my briefcase on the table next to her podium and opened it. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "My name," I said, turning to address the room of stunned homeowners, "is the executor of my grandfather's estate, and in my professional capacity as a real estate attorney for the past 15 years, I've had to review the complete, recorded history of this land. And I've discovered a rather inconvenient truth for you, Carol." I pulled out the first document, a vast, certified copy of the official county plat map. I unfolded it dramatically across the table, a sea of black and white lines. "This," I announced, "is the legally recorded map of the Whispering Pines HOA, filed with the county. It defines the exact legal boundaries of your community. Now, can anyone show me where my property, 1 Old Valley Road, is located within those red lines?" It wasn't. It was clearly, unequivocally shown outside the line. A nervous energy, a ripple of doubt filled the room. Carol's face had gone chalk white. "Now, here's where it gets exciting," I continued, my voice cold and precise. "This isn't just an oversight. It was intentional." I pulled out the original sale agreement. "This is the contract between my grandfather, the man who sold this land to your developer, and the developer himself. It contains a clause written by my grandfather and initialed by both parties, explicitly stating his remaining property is permanently and irrevocably excluded from this HOA. I looked directly at Carol, whose facade of power had shattered entirely. "For months, you have been harassing me, levying illegal fines and trespassing on my property. You have done this either knowing you have no authority, which constitutes fraud, or being so grossly negligent in not knowing the legal boundaries of your own association that you are unfit to hold this office. You've been wasting this community's money to fund your personal vendetta against a man you have no power over." The room erupted. People were shouting, standing up, yelling questions at a stunned Carol. She was staring at the papers, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. I raised my voice over the din. "This means the fines are void. The violations are void, and this foreclosure vote is a legal absurdity. I have already filed a formal complaint against this HOA and its board members for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. My lawyers will be seeking full compensatory damages and the complete repayment of all legal fees spent defending my property from this baseless attack." Carol finally found her voice. It was a shrill, desperate shriek. "He's lying! This is wild! It's a trick! Security, remove him!" "Your security is a volunteer neighbor named Bob who sells insurance, Carol," I said calmly. And I'm not finished. I turned back to the stunned homeowners, who were now looking at Carol with open hostility. Your problem isn't with me. It's with a president who acts illegally, exposes this community to massive legal liability, and spends your mandatory dues doing it. Then I looked back at Carol. Her reign was over. As for your presidency, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, I have a feeling your neighbors will be handling that. Good luck with the recall vote. And with the lawsuit. I packed my documents back into my briefcase, turned my back on her sputtering, enraged form, and walked out of the clubhouse into the fresh, clean air of my very, very large and now very peaceful property. The aftermath was exactly as chaotic and beautiful as you might imagine. Carol's meltdown in the clubhouse became the stuff of local legend. Witnesses said she stood at the podium screaming about conspiracies and forgeries until one of the other board members. This man clearly saw the impending legal and financial train wreck and gently but firmly escorted her out of the room. Her little kingdom, built on bluff and bluster, had crumbled to dust in 10 minutes. The next morning, my phone started ringing, and it didn't stop. One by one, my new neighbors called, not to complain, but to thank me. I heard years of pent-up frustration and stories of the stress Carol's regime had inflicted on them. One elderly woman tearfully told me she spent thousands from her retirement savings to repaint her house, a house she had lived in for 20 years, because Carol decided the original shade of beige was too vibrant. A young family told me they were fined weekly because their son's treehouse was an unapproved structure. Another man told me he was forced to remove a basketball hoop because of the noise pollution of a bouncing ball. They were all trapped by a tyrant, and I had just handed them the keys to their own prison. My lawsuit didn't go far because it didn't have to. Faced with irrefutable evidence of their president's gross misconduct and the threat of a massive judgment that would bankrupt the association, the HOA's insurance carrier stepped in. They immediately forced the board to settle. The board issued a formal, written apology on behalf of the entire community, and I was reimbursed for every single penny of my legal fees. Carol didn't go down without a fight, of course. She tried to rally support, claiming she was the victim of a coordinated attack. But it was no use. The homeowners, now armed with the truth about her illegal actions and how their dues had been used to fund her personal war, were furious. They initiated a formal recall, and she was overwhelmingly voted out of office in a landslide. The board members who had stood by her and enabled her behavior were also unceremoniously replaced in the next election. What happened to Carol? With her power gone and her reputation in tatters, she became a pariah in the community she once ruled with an iron fist. The same neighbors she had terrorized with fines and threats now just ignored her, giving her the ultimate punishment: irrelevance. She couldn't handle being a regular person with no authority. Last I heard, she sold her house, at a slight loss, I might add, due to the market uncertainty she herself had created, and moved away. I have no idea where she went, but I sincerely hope there isn't an HOA. Today, the valley is quiet again, but it's a quiet of a different kind. It's a peaceful, serene. The homes in Whispering Pines are now a little more colorful. There's a treehouse in one yard, a vibrant garden gnome in another, and an incredible variety of mailboxes in all shapes and colors. It's a real community now. People talk to each other over their fences and look out for one another without the need for a tyrant and a 1,000-page rule book. As for me, I finally get to enjoy my grandfather's legacy the way it was meant to be enjoyed. I spend my weekends at the cabin, hiking the trails, breathing the clean air, and feeling the deep sense of peace he found here. Sometimes I'll drive through the neighboring development and people wave. They're not just neighbors. They're partners in a strange, shared history. I inherited 847 acres of land, but in the process of defending my little corner of it, I ended up liberating a whole community. I stood up to a bully, but more importantly, I exposed an abuse of power and helped restore a little bit of peace to the valley for everyone. And that, more than any amount of land, is an inheritance worth fighting for. What would you have done? Would you have just paid the fines to make it all go away, or would you have dug for the truth? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.